Without, without further ado, before I invite Professor Rose Boswell to present for us, I would just like to reiterate some housekeeping rules. I see most of you have already turned off your cameras to protect the connection speed. And you're welcome to unmute to make your camera visible if you have any questions to ask. Alternatively, you could drop a question, which we will then relay to Professor Boswell as the presentation will be going on. So without further ado, I now welcome Professor Rose to go on with her presentation.
Thank you very much, Denning, and thanks to the CMR, the Coastal and Marine Research Institute, for the opportunity to speak at the beginning of Heritage Month. I do have a set of slides that I'd like to share, and I think I will just get straight to that, if that is all right with everybody.
I'm sure that will be just fine, Rose. Thank you.
All right. Sorry, just get to the... Sorry, there's something going on here. Some of this. There we go. Thank you. All right. So let me begin. Nelson Mandela University is advancing transdisciplinary research and analysis, especially in the ocean sciences space, as the university seeks holistic solutions to some challenging problems of climate change and ocean degradation. But a challenge remains in that discipline-specific domains can often be quite restrictive, and the subjects that we teach and we research may be perceived as the domain of discipline-trained specialists. When it comes to the law, however, I think that technically most of us should be interested, as the implementation of the law actually affects our own personal reality. But having said this, I think it's important to tread carefully in the presentation of any data on the law, respecting the detail and complexities of the law, and recognizing that, in fact, ultimately, there is no pressure on national government to give full expression to international agreements and conventions it has signed or ratified. So my task is to focus primarily on the National Heritage Resources Act, which was passed in 1999. I think this ultimately is the only real instrument of heritage management in South Africa, which to my mind is outdated and fails to make adequate provision for the safeguarding of South Africa's rich, intangible cultural heritage, never mind its marine intangible cultural heritage, about which I will speak in a few moments. A major reason for advancing and deepening research on heritage and ICH, or intangible heritage, in Africa, and to interrogate NARA, or the National Heritage Resources Act, is that I seek in my work to advance the long and necessary process of decolonization and the recentering of knowledge, foundations, and epistemologies. If we do not document, consider, analyze, and research ICH, we will miss a great deal of South Africa's beliefs, knowledge forms, reasoning, wisdom, and values. In the past week, the chair program hosted our postdoctoral candidate, Dr. Moteo Koetsiwe, who spoke about indigenous astronomy among the Botswana and the relevance of this scientific knowledge for a reorientation of the way we think about indigenous peoples, including the idea that as indigenous knowledge systems, or IKS practitioners, we must simply provide equally valuable equivalencies in culture, language, etc., in order to prove the worth and substance of indigenous knowledge. The debates, complex as they are not only relevant to indigenes in South Africa or Africa, but to members of the African diaspora and the world. And it is for this reason that I think that our postdocs, and I see Elena is also on the participant list today. She is also another of the postdocs on the Saatchi Ocean Cultures and Heritage Program. And the reason why Elena, Moteo, and myself and others on the team are really keen on investigating intangible cultural heritage and the ways in which perhaps legislative environments, indigenous knowledge system environments influence heritage management is precisely to advance heritage conservation in Africa and global awareness of the rich heritages that exist on the continent. September is Heritage Month in South Africa, but for the most part, South Africans only appear to consider and think about heritage on Heritage Day itself, which has now been renamed National Braai Day. The aim of National Braai Day is to assert national unity and recognize the common heritage of South Africans to overcome the country's divisive past. South Africa has national legislation now in the form of NARA, or the National Heritage Resources Act, to promote and advance the conservation of tangible and living heritage. But as already indicated, the law is outdated and does not make provision for marine intangible cultural heritage in South Africa. And moreover, when you look at this particular slide, you can see that heritage has different meanings to people across the South African context, but also across the continent. On the far left of the screen, you have the emphasis on National Braai Day and the fact that perhaps people, because of this talk of national unity and common heritage, we have perhaps forgotten about the particularities of heritage within the South African context. And then the middle slide basically refers to the enduring relevance of culture and heritage to peoples in the African diaspora, that it forms an integral part of their lives, whether they are living inland or at the coast. And then, of course, the importance of heritage to our personal identity and to what we would in anthropology call diacritical markers, or the ways in which we use material culture to present ourselves to a social world. So South Africa has the National Heritage Resources Act, and this, in a way, is supposed to encapsulate this very complex landscape of both personal and public heritage management. Another context which is emerging and which is incredibly important, of course, is the ocean economy landscape and the purpose, the deeper purpose of the presentation this afternoon. The United Nations IOC recognizes world marine heritage and has done so since 2005. And in collaboration with NOAA, the United Nations has instituted a program for the conservation of world marine heritage. And in particular, this refers to marine biodiversity, but also increasingly, we also see tangible coastal heritages being conserved. In the South African context, we now have Operation Phakisa, which is the national strategy for the development of the ocean economy. And Operation Phakisa is aligned to SDG 14, which is specifically concerned with the conservation and the protection of ocean sustainability. If we look very closely at Operation Phakisa, it also speaks very much about poverty alleviation and equality, because there is a strong economic focus in Operation Phakisa. For instance, the government estimates, and this is in their online document, that the ocean economy can generate some 177 billion rand for this economy, or in this economy rather, by 2033. and that if fully implemented, it can actually create about 1 million jobs, which is critical in South Africa when one considers both the national unemployment and also the regional unemployment rate in the Eastern Cape province. Similarly, we have now the Eastern Cape Ocean Economy Master Plan, which is particularly relevant to this economically poor province in which we are situated. And it is estimated, or it is, it is thought that this particular master plan will help, the implementation of it rather, will help to generate employment, reduce poverty, and make Nelson Mandela Bay the country's premier marine development destination. The Ocean Economy Plan is the result, as some of you already know, is the result of collaboration between the Department of Environment, Fisheries and Forestry, together with the Department of, the Eastern Cape Provincial Government, and the Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. And if you look very closely at what is actually on the NMU site regarding this master plan, it consists of 4 parts: a fairly detailed baseline study, a strategic roadmap, a research agenda, as well as a bid book. But beyond these national concerns, and of course also the UN IOC mentioned at the start of this particular slide, the ocean economy landscape, or rather the ocean landscape, also includes the persistent challenge of climate change and its impact on the oceans and oceans economies. And in this regard, COP26, which is the meeting of the UN IPCC in November 2021, basically refers, nation states primarily have or are going to be encouraged to dramatically reduce their carbon emissions to better safeguard the oceans and to secure fish stocks, which are dwindling, as well as marine biodiversity, and of course the integrity of the climate. So this is quite a complex landscape in which, you know, the heritage issues of South Africa and the African continent as a whole is founded. We have both of these international obligations and responsibilities, as well as economic imperatives within the national context of South Africa that have to be attended to. So as indicated, the presentation proposes that the National Heritage Resources Act 25 of 1999 is insufficient in its provision for the recognition and protection of marine intangible cultural heritage, or MICH, in South Africa. And to facilitate the discussion, I will touch on 2 other laws: the National Environmental Management Protected Areas Act of 2003 and the Integrated Coastal Management Act of 2008. The presentation will also consider the relevance and the form of ICH to inclusive and ethical development, as well as the role of ICH in coastal development and management in the broader South African context. So before pressing on with critical heritage studies, I think it's important to point out the differences between tangible and intangible heritage for those of you who are new to this subject. Essentially, tangible heritages refer to the sites, monuments, archaeological objects, objects of material culture, anything that we can potentially touch or palpate. Whereas intangible cultural heritage refers to the rituals, myths, legends, folklore, poetic endeavor, songs, anything that in fact cannot be palpated or touched. And in fact, there isn't, scholars agree that there isn't always a definitive dividing line between tangible and intangible cultural heritage. And in fact, there is quite a lot of debate around this dichotomy, which has been created in a way by UNESCO for it to be able to properly and formally identify heritages for inscription on the World Heritage lists. But critical heritage studies is where this particular paper is actually located. And in recent decades, critical heritage studies have proposed that we need to be very cautious because heritage conservation is politicized. It's not a neutral political endeavor. It can be quite an unequal process. It risks sedimenting or ossifying culture rather than maintaining its dynamism. But despite these critiques, heritage conservation still remains a compelling proposition for nation states and their inhabitants, as it endorses a human rights-based approach to development, which is a globally accepted route for the conservation of socially meaningful public sites, memories, and legacies. So in essence, what has happened in the last, I would say 30 years or so in this field of studies is that people have dispensed with the idea of heritage as a sort of legacy, an uncomplicated legacy that one can pass from one generation to the next, that you can just put in place seemingly apolitical bodies and institutions to manage and process heritage for the good of the nation. And that in fact, what we tend to find is that the heritages that are conserved are often those that belong to those who are the elite or who are in power in the society, or they belong to dominant groups. And what that means then is that the heritages of those who are perhaps marginalized in the society, those who hold intangible heritages, these heritages are often not really conserved, not really rendered public, and don't attract the attention of major heritage regimes like UNESCO. So there's quite a lot of sort of theoretical, sort of space that we have, work that is going on in the space of heritage. I've already mentioned the term World Heritage Regime. These basically produce what we call authorized discourses or discussions or public presentations of heritage, authorized public presentations of heritage in the form of World Heritage Sites, the WHL or the World Heritage List, and of course the list of oral and intangible cultural heritages. So there are separate lists that are created by UNESCO for the public and universal recognition of these heritages on a world scale. There are also historical views of heritage, as I have already indicated, the problematic idea of heritage as legacy, the more critical understanding of heritage as a metacultural product. In other words, it is there to potentially elevate the specific cultural aspects or identities or values of a particular group above others. The notion of heritage as service, heritage as symbols of power, and of course the ongoing discussions around the divisions or the dichotomy of tangible and intangible heritage. This leads to fairly detailed, often discussions around the politics of heritage. In other words, what are the heritages of the other? Are there other heritages? And of course, for many centuries in the African context, and of course also in South Africa, the heritages of the indigenous and long-standing or autochthonous peoples of the country were perceived as the heritages of the other. Some have also discussed heritage as colonization, and more recently, given the implementation of the Indigenous Knowledge Act in South Africa in 2019, we are now looking at heritage and IKS in more detail. But heritage has also been implicated in development. Heritage is perceived as a human right, that it is necessary for inclusion, for ethical development, for equality. And more recently, and of course the subject of the discussion here, is heritage in the marine and maritime sphere. So we're looking at marine heritage, marine cultural heritage, that is the tangible heritage in the marine space, marine biodiversity or natural heritage, and the subject of Elena's postdoc, which is underwater cultural heritage. What about the situation in Africa? Well, the situation in Africa is that there are very few sites that are actually tangible sites that are even inscribed on the in the African context, never mind intangible cultural heritage or marine intangible cultural heritage. Globally, there are more than 1,000 World Heritage Sites today. And as indicated, only 145 are in Africa. The majority of the sites inscribed are in Europe, North America, and Asia. And globally, there are only 50 marine World Heritage Sites. 2 of these are in Africa. And globally, as I said, there are no, as far as we know, there are no marine intangible cultural heritages that are inscribed. Although I hasten to add that there are mixed, what we call mixed cultural and natural sites across the world. And in some instances, these fall in coastal areas. And in that sense, then we find that a coastal cultural heritage may be recognized. So what this tells us actually is that presently Africa is woefully underrepresented on the WHL, or the World Heritage List, and the list of oral and intangible heritages. And the lack of representation, I think it forms part of a long history of silencing and erasure in Africa, which many post-colonial authors have written about. So if you look at the South African context, you will see at the bottom of this map, you will see there the Cape Floristic Kingdom, and most of these are in fact internal sites, except for the mixed cultural and natural site of Mapungubwe. And then also, if you look at the St. Lucia's, I'm assuming that must be St. Lucia's Wetlands Park there on that edge. We as yet, we don't have any World Marine Heritage Sites, either in the tangible sense or in the intangible context. Now, the National Heritage Resources Act of '99 forms part of a suite of legislations that aim to advance heritage conservation in the country. There was a very detailed assessment that was actually done by a law firm on the heritage legislations of South Africa. It was published in 2019. It's quite a recent document, and I think we can take that as being a fairly accurate representation of the heritage legislation that exists in the country. The following laws were identified as important to heritage conservation in South Africa. There's the Cultural Promotion Act of 1983, Cultural Institutions Act, the South African Geographical Names Council Act, the National Heritage Council Act, the National Council of Library and Information Services Act, the National Library of South Africa Act, the African Library for the Blind Act, Legal Deposit Act, National Archives and Records of Service Act, and the Heraldry Act. So in this legal and comprehensive overview of heritage legislation in South Africa, it was actually noted that none of these actually make any specific heritage to living or intangible cultural heritage. Now, if we look at the National Heritage Resources Act in its definitions, it does indicate that living heritage consists of various things, including the holistic approach to nature, society, and social relationships. It also indicates that heritage that has a strong or special association with a particular community or cultural group for social, cultural, or spiritual reasons should be conserved or protected. So it states that upfront, but thereafter things become quite sort of very generalized. So I've indicated that none of these, the suite of legislations, none of them refer to ICH and its conservation. I will get to the third point now, but if we look very carefully at NARA, the law basically goes on to focus on the assessment criteria, the grading, the duties of the heritage managers, the separation of powers between the heritage managers, i.e. the distinction, for example, between the South African Heritage Resources Agency, which is a national body that is tasked with the overall management and protection of heritage in South Africa on behalf of the National Heritage Council, And then we also have these provincial heritage resources agencies, or PRAs as they call them, that are located in each province and is supposed to engage with local authorities in order to conserve heritage, to identify heritage, and to manage all queries and developments that may actually affect heritage sites and heritages of value. But the remainder of the act kind of focuses on places that need to be managed, the duties and the jurisdictions of the heritage managers, the separation of powers, the grading of heritage, and nowhere in the language of the act, and I mean, this could be a terribly short presentation, but nowhere in the language of the act is there an explicit reference to the forms that intangible cultural heritage may take, and the duties that these various heritage officials would have in identifying such heritages at risk, attending to them, protecting them, and so on. And in fact, it's quite interesting because there was a report that I prepared a couple of months back for another entity where we were looking at communications, for example, between various government departments to see to what extent, you know, are these designated heritage authorities, in fact, you know, really carrying out the requirements or responsibilities, rather, that are noted for them in the National Heritage Resources Act. And to cut a very long story short, what was found is that these heritage bodies, especially in the Eastern Cape province, these heritage bodies were in fact not communicating very well with the other sectoral interests or powers within government. So for example, you know, where the rights of communities, for example, have to be perhaps protected insofar as the use of coastal areas is concerned, that these heritage resource managers were in fact not really communicating with those entities, but in fact their main task had been for some time to basically issue permits for construction or issue permits for the demolition of particular buildings that or sites that would be seen, that could potentially be of heritage value to the national estate of South Africa. So even when we consider, I mean, getting to point 3 now, even though marine heritage is encapsulated or covered, as it were, by the comments that are made on natural heritage, again, because there's very little consideration of ICH or intangible cultural heritage itself, there's no mention, you know, of the fact that there might be marine or natural, other forms of natural intangible cultural heritages that exist out there. And in the discussion on natural heritage, the emphasis is placed on the site specificness of it, its tangibility, and the fact that, you know, that all of these things are believed to require the same safeguards as tangible heritage. I don't go into much detail regarding the Protected Areas Act or the Integrated Coastal Management Act. I had a quick look at them, and I think that, you know, these deserve a more detailed kind of legal treatment and assessment. But a close look at these two acts also suggests that these are not really interested in intangible cultural heritage or MICH either. They talk about the inclusion of local peoples and the need for local communities to be consulted when coastal management is actually taking place, but they do not refer to marine intangible cultural heritage and the ways in which these, you know, particular heritages need to be conserved. Yeah, so that's really an issue. Even when we consider the Underwater Heritage Convention, Underwater Cultural Heritage Convention, which has been ratified by South Africa, we find that again, the focus is on tangible heritage. If you go to the SARA or the South African Heritage Resources site, they specifically focus on the shipwrecks and other tangible artifacts that are to be found under the water within the EEZ, or the Exclusive Economic Zone of South Africa. So there's no mention of the sort of maritime intangible heritage, the rich naval heritage that South Africa may have, or and the ways in which these histories may actually contribute to the formation of contribute to the national estate of the country. Now, if we dig a little bit deeper, it's not only that NARA just kind of generally refers to living heritage and leaves it at that. I also found that, and I mean, it's not, I mean, this paper was prepared a couple of months ago, so perhaps in that time space, things have changed. But when I last looked, South Africa has no authority designated to use the UNESCO ICH emblem, or the Intangible Cultural Heritage emblem. And in order to actually manage, identify, nominate, a first step is to actually obtain from UNESCO the authority to use the UNESCO emblem. Now, it's quite strange because other countries that may be perceived as LDCs or less developed countries in the SADC region, a lot of them already have attained the authority designated to use the UNESCO ICH emblem, which means that they can now go ahead and the government can now go ahead and instruct its heritage resource managers to begin the process of identifying potential intangible cultural heritages, sites that are of great value. For example, in the paper, I talk about it's inland, but just on the basis of intangible cultural heritage, the Vavenda People's Lake Fundudzi, for example, which is a site that is sacred, but it's also potentially a national and world heritage site. And that has not, we don't have the authority to use the UNESCO emblem. And that is an administrative issue. It is also unclear. I found out that it was also strangely, I mean, it was weird, unclear that whether South Africa has participated in the 2020 capacity building endeavor initiated by UNESCO, which is also designed to advance ICH nomination and conservation. So there are quite a few gaps. It's not just, it's not just in NARA itself, but if we look beyond NARA, we can see there are other areas of insufficiency or potential gaps that need to be attended to if ICH, or intangible cultural heritage, and then of course marine intangible cultural heritage, is going to be identified, nominated, inscribed, and conserved in South Africa. And as yet, South Africa has no world ICH. So we have the mixed cultural and natural site at Makungubwe. We have a number of natural sites, but we don't have any world ICH, which is really unusual for a country that is so culturally diverse. When we look at the international conventions and declarations to which South Africa is signatory, it is signatory to several international conventions that touch on the issue of heritage and the rights of indigenous peoples. It also recognizes, South Africa also recognizes the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And in the latter, the United Nations specifically calls for improvements to ocean health and an inclusive approach to achieving ocean sustainability. So both the declarations and conventions signed produce particular obligations for the South African government. And I think part of this involves necessary legal reforms that can deepen inclusion in the country. So if you have a look at the national estate, and we look at the historic tangible sites that have actually been conserved in South Africa, and not even at the national level, if you just look at the provincial level, you look at provincial heritage resources sites, very few of them are actually sites that are associated with indigenous peoples. And a lot of them are sites that are associated with the colonial past. And this is a problem because South Africa is, as I point out in the paper, it is signatory to the UNDRIP, or the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It is also signatory, as I've indicated, to the UN, UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. There are a number of international conventions which are pointed out in the detailed paper, which is in the process for publication. And as soon as it's out, I'll be quite happy to share it with everyone. I mean, if we look at I know that there's some people here who are actually from the Bay. If we look at the situation here in the Bay, of course, there are, international conventions as well regarding the cultural industries, regarding tourism, and so on. And so there is, in a way, an obligation on the part of government to start paying closer attention to these conventions which it has signed, and which in a way puts it in a position where it must, follow through on conventions and declarations that have been ratified. At the continental level, and to fully realize the aims of the World Heritage Convention, South Africa is also part of UNESCO IOC Subcommission for Africa and the adjacent island states, otherwise known as IOC Africa. And in this regard, it has in fact accepted the IOC Africa's strategic plan, which has been, hopefully, the idea is that it was being implemented from 2014 to 2021. As a member of IOC Africa, South Africa would have taken note of the subcommission's comments on the dangers or the loss or modification of ecosystems, the overexploitation of resources, and the use of destructive fishing practices. Case studies already show the loss and the degradation of MICH due to insufficient legislation, which I'll discuss next. But before I do that, you can possibly already see that there are quite important tensions, right, between, on the one hand, this desire and the need for rapid economic development, given the fact that we are now 20 plus years past the end of apartheid, 300 plus years after colonial rule, and we still have a very high unemployment rate in South Africa. We still have people who are living in dire poverty, and with the pandemic that is now also raging in the country, this has had a devastating impact on the employment of local people, whether it is as entrepreneurs in small businesses related to tourism and so on, or as individuals that have just ordinary jobs. A lot of people have been laid off. So in a way, government has put forward Operation Pakisa as a major project to really boost the economy of the country, and the Eastern Cape Ocean Economy Master Plan to do the same at the regional level. But let me take you to some of the anthropological work that we've been doing as a team, partly for the UKRI funded One Ocean Hub, but also for the Saatchi Chair Ocean Cultures and Heritage. And thirdly, also for a third project funded by the NRF called the Community of Practice Project on the Oceans Account Framework. Now, the third project deals very much with the issue of the cultural valuation. We're very interested in the cultural valuation of the oceans, the intangible cultural heritage that is associated with coastal areas and coastal peoples, and that is what we're investigating for the Oceans Account Framework project. And for the One Ocean Hub, we are very concerned about marginalized narratives, marginalized and vulnerable groups in the small scale fisheries sector, but also those who are associated with but are not part of the SSF or small scale fishery sector specifically. So when the team that I set up started interviewing local community members from Algoa Bay through to Tsitsikamma at this point in time, but we're also hoping to extend further west through to Mossel Bay. Some of the things that they said were as follows: the ocean is important to us. Many of our kids have never been to the ocean. Even my son, my cousin's boy, he's 5 years old, never been to the ocean. And this is because of they're talking about the effect of the marine protected area in Tsitsikamma. But more than that, if there had been legislation dealing with MICH, or there had been more detail on MICH in NARA, some of these things may never have occurred, even though we would have, obviously you can't have everything in the world, but we would have protected the marine biodiversity in that space. You know, but on the other hand, now we have a group of people who, you know, have very limited access to the sea. People talk about the fact that they've lost the tradition of how to look after the sea, that some of them grew up with the ocean and they knew not to litter, to break or to take out too much. But now other people who have not been there don't educate their children. They don't know about species that ought not to be killed or not to take out certain shellfish and so on. So it's not just a case of the fact that we have this gap in the legislation, and that it's a gap that, you know, we need to fill in order to meet sort of broader democratic requirements of inclusion, but it has long-term cascading effects. If we don't have these, you know, marine intangible cultural heritage being included in some of these laws that I have mentioned, or being noted as being significant in some of these laws, then we have a situation where knowledge that existed about the conservation of the environment, wisdom, values of being within the coastal environment are also eroded, such that people no longer remember. Another person said, the sea has a lot of medicine for us to make us healthy. I don't go to the doctor, I am my own doctor. They use salt water as an emetic. And then they said, but now we are forbidden to go to the sea. We can't go to the sea anymore. And I don't know how long it will take for us to be able to go back to where I come from. And then we asked the seminal question at the beginning of the set of interviews about what were people's first memories of the ocean, what was really important to them. And some of them talked about the fact that the sea was so special to them that it formed an integral part of their identity, their daily rhythms of life, which of course, you know, we recognize the importance of MPAs, but on the other hand, it almost feels like we needed the inclusion of marine intangible cultural heritage in order to balance out these you know, different forms, different stakeholders' access to the ocean. There was also another paper that was published, entitled Including the Khoisan for a More Inclusive Blue Economy. And that was authored by Dr. Jess Thornton and myself. And there we found that actually, if you look closely at the First Nations people of South Africa, again, that there is this holistic engagement with the oceans and coasts. And to a certain extent, this then speaks to the part of NARA that talks about living heritage being the holistic approach to nature, society, and social relationships. So in a way, NARA has edged towards a consideration of this holistic engagement with the environment, but it has not taken it through to its logical conclusion in that law. And I mean, if you consider that this law has now been in existence since 1999, I think it's really well overdue for you know, a review. So in this quote, we talk about the wind as the wind also featuring in calm accounts of rain and storms. There is what we call an aqueous holism in sand beliefs, the idea that humans are intricately connected to all forms and mediums of wind carrying water. Mediums carrying water, that natural, seemingly inanimate elements possess life and therefore deserve respect and appropriate approach. Just to unpack that quote, what we're saying there is that if we look at Khoisan myths, legends, also the ways in which the local communities are speaking about the environment, they don't just talk about the coast, the sea, seawater as emetic. They talk about the wind carrying water. They talk about rain. They talk about the entire ecosystem, the entire ecological circle between the ocean, the mist creating, you know, clouds. All of these are perceived as belonging to one integrative whole. So when we talk about ocean cultures and heritage, in a way, we really have our work cut out for us, because it's not just that we're looking at what is happening palpably at the coast, we're also seeking in a way to understand these integrative, like, understandings of the environment, which quite a lot of people in the anthropological space, especially those dealing with environmental anthropology, have been talking about for years, but not many have been looking at it within the context of the oceans and coasts. So I now reach the conclusion of the paper, and I want to say that part of my work has not only been in the South African context. Part of this work has also taken place in the Western Indian Ocean diaspora, specifically in Mauritius, for quite a number of years. And what we're seeing there is, in fact, a complete absence of marine intangible cultural heritage, being legislated or included in any kind of document, for that nation state. And these are some of the dangers. So just beginning with this piece here at the top, which I wrote way back in 2008. So when there is perhaps no concern for intangible cultural heritage at the coast or in a marine context, you can have unchecked gentrification or development, which then displaces groups that, people in the Ocean Hub and the Oceans Account Framework group might be interested in, or small scale fishers. There's just no regard for what is to happen to these people. So as the development of the state picks up or increases, there is this, this emphasis on gentrification at the coast, because these are often areas of prime real estate. And that is what started to happen in Mauritius way back in 2005, 2006, and I started writing about it in 2008. To the extent that, and Mauritius is tiny compared to South Africa, of course. I mean, South Africa has 6,000 kilometers of coastline, but in Mauritius now, the public or the citizens only really have access to about 8% of public beaches. So the remaining 92% is taken up by integrated resort schemes and hotels. So we have to ask ourselves, what impact, the not having a couple of lines, in a particular legislation, the impact that it can have on the population as a whole. The second one, there are two pieces that speak to one another. Both of them refer to the recent oil spill of the MV Wakasho in Mauritius in August last year. And we're seeing now that there was literally, some of this could have actually been prevented. I mean, it's a very complex case about which this particular paper is hoping to take up. But again, if we look at the conservation, the marine conservation initiatives in Mauritius, the emphasis was very much on the protection of marine biodiversity, protection of the corals, ensuring that ocean acidification is something that is kept at bay in order to protect fish stocks and other marine life. And to a large extent, the rights of small-scale fishers have been, eroded over the years, and general public access to the oceans for cultural or other purposes has been dramatically, eroded as well. And so I think there are dangers. I mean, here I'm just talking about the effects of an oil spill from a bulk carrier that happened to, well, it didn't happen to be there. It was passing through the territorial waters of Mauritius. But in the context of South Africa, I must take you back now to the Eastern Cape Ocean Economy Master Plan. And if you read not the baseline study, but the strategic report, it talks about suggestions, for example, of an oil refinery at Kucha and the creation of an oil pipeline from the Nelson Mandela Bay, from Kucha, all the way to Mossel Bay, and then ultimately from Kucha all the way through to KZN. And I suppose some of these important discussions are taking place in spaces where valuations are different. But it's very important for people who are involved in the ocean sciences to have an eye not only on those local stakeholders, small scale fishers, and their current access to the ocean and their current rights or their current heritages, but to also think about future heritages, things that might be lost, for example, if certain forms of unchecked development go ahead. And to ask ourselves whether, the legal frameworks that we not the legal frameworks, the laws that we currently have are in fact doing justice to the very rich intangible cultural heritages of the country. So thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you for that, Rose. That was a very informative presentation you just did. And I must admit, I am one of those who often overlooks the aspects of intangible heritage that people may have. I remember when I first came to South Africa, the first December I spent in South Africa, and I noticed that so many people wanted to come to the sea and swim. And I heard things such as it's a yearly ritual. They do it to cleanse themselves of whatever issues they may have had during the year in preparation for a new year. That is something that is easily overlooked when, let's say, the lawmakers are drafting these legal frameworks you made a reference to. And not in the form of a question, but I'm just going to add my voice to what you just said. And before I do that, I must apologize to all those with us today. At the start of the presentation, I experienced some technical issues. I thought I was actually presenting and no one was hearing me. So I'm Dr. Dening Mituge. I'm with the South African Research Chair in the Law of the Sea. And I'm privileged to be chairing this presentation today. So adding to this presentation and this and Rose identifying loopholes in the National Heritage Resources Act, so far as it makes no specific references to intangible cultural heritage, I do agree that there is a need for an amendment to this legal instrument to make it explicitly clear that there is a place for intangible cultural heritage and that it must be taken into account when determining issues such as MPAs and other protected areas along the coast of South Africa. However, I must say a reason why this is even more important is because of the constitutional provisions that make it mandatory for the organs of state to take into account the culture of the local people. But again, leaving the provisions of the law to interpretation by representatives of organs of states and state departments who are not legal experts in itself is a big issue. So yes, I reiterate and I support and approve that truly there is need for amendments to the National Heritage Resources Act and the Protected Areas Act, amongst others, to reflect that due consideration is afforded to intangible cultural heritage. With that being said, I would like to throw it to the floor. If anyone has some input with regard to the presentation or questions that you would like to direct to Rose at this time. Well, Rose, we have some silence, which on the one hand I think is understandable because you were so clear and explained all of your points so well, leaving very little room to confusion of any sorts. So maybe you may want to add something of your own, something maybe you thought you didn't um, share with us earlier.
Thanks, Denning. I think if I just can look at the Mauritius case, I think that is so. It's quite shocking actually, because I was really looking at all the sort of documentation regarding the MV Wakasha oil spill, and of course, you know, I mean, I don't know if some colleagues here have been following some of the work of Merle Soman and others who have been writing about South Africa's interest in developing offshore exploration and specifically development. I know I see Haley and colleagues are here, but it is a concern, I think, for South Africa. And we do need a more protective legislation in place, because from what I understand from Merle's presentations and also her work is that more than, I think, 90% of the sites have already been leased for offshore development. And it will be quite interesting to see, you know, how these, you know, fairly, in a way, dangerous, but also potentially polluting kind of activities, if something were to go wrong, what measures there are in place to actually protect South Africa's coastlines, not only in the natural sense, but to protect people's, you know, cultural livelihoods and social livelihoods as well. And I think that is always a big concern. If we look at just how often, even if it's not the pipeline that is, you know, compromised, but if you look at, for example, what happened with MV Wakasha, where it was just the transportation, you know, of the oil. And if we're going to have an oil refinery, for example, at Kucha, it would be interesting to see, you know, how that will be managed, because at the moment, I have a PhD student who's quite interested in looking at port management and corruption in ports, mismanagement at ports. And we really don't want to end up with a situation where, you know, something goes awry and we have fairly, especially here in Nelson Mandela Bay, we have a fairly pristine bay, blue flag beaches. And as Karen from Raggy Charters has pointed out, you know, the Nelson Mandela Bay is also now one of the considered to be an important whale heritage site. So it's well known for its, you know, its marine, the cetaceans that are to be found, you know, in our waters, dolphins and whales and so on. So we really don't want that kind of natural marine heritage to be compromised. But at the same time, we also recognize that people have a cultural relationship with the sea, which is just as important as the marine biodiversity to be found within. So yeah, so this is the ongoing, you know, research, different domains that we're doing as part of our team.
Thank you, Rose. I can't help but think, given the constitutional provisions with regard to the development of the environment, which includes the marine environment as well, I believe that a great emphasis needs to be placed in the consultative process and the impact assessments as well. Because as you rightly said, since the onset of Operation Kisa, a lot of emphasis has been placed on economic aspects of ocean uses, and greatly to the detriment of aspects such as intangible cultural heritage. But I can't help but think that in a rush to arrive at these sustainable outcomes, in quotes, more time needs to be put into the impact assessment process and the consultative processes so that at the end of the day, whatever product we have is truly representative of the vast cultural diversity that is characteristic of South Africa, amongst other things. Well, yeah, that's just my, my last point on this. But otherwise, I've really enjoyed being here with you and listening to your presentation, and I'm sure I speak for everyone here with us. And we were set to do this for an hour, and we've used that hour. If there's nothing else, I would like to thank everyone, especially you, Rose, for opening up this month, this Cultural Heritage Month, with such a high bar. And I'm excited for the next presentations to come already. Thank you so much for your time, Rose, for this presentation. And thank you everyone else for participating.
All right, thank you, bye-bye.
Okay, and on to the next one. Thank you all, bye-bye.